So let me give you a little bit of background. If you were in the previous panel discussion, I did mention that I have been teaching at specialty schools for science, technology, and mathematics and engineering for the last nearly 30 years. In 1992, I was hired to, oh, don't see the file. Let me just check here. Files, computational, oh, I just inadvertently deleted it. Okay, that file should be shared now. It says sharing. Again, if you could throw me an affirmation. Xander got it. Good. So it's available. I'm going to refer to it. So you might even want to pull it up on the side or print it so you can refer to it. But as I said, it's also in the sticky note here. So anyway, I found myself hired to be the orchestra director at Eleanor Roosevelt High School outside of Greenbelt, Maryland, in Greenbelt, Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C., in Prince George's County, an urban high school with about 4,000 students, with an orchestra magnet program as part of the school as well, and a very large music program. And so at the ripe old age of 27, I found myself at this STEM school, a magnet school, and I taught there through the 90s. And then in 2000, the principal of that school became the director of the North Carolina School of Science and Math. And he was only here a couple of weeks when he called me and he said, Scott, we need you at the School of Science and Math. Let me see if I can get a position put together for you. And by 2001, I interviewed for a position as orchestra director at the North Carolina School of Science and Math in Durham. And hey, Rachel, nice to see you. And I ended up coming to North Carolina in Durham. So and for the last 19 years, I've been teaching here. Our school is a resident school for students from across the state of North Carolina. If students are accepted into our school based on their SATs and their grades and some other criteria, they get a full scholarship to come and live at our school for their junior and senior year of high school. So we're part of the University of North Carolina. We're one of the 17 constituent institutions of the university, and we're the only one that exclusively teaches high school students. So my job is to work with these students who come from all over the state in the orchestra. And as a result of their interests, I've become very interested in collaborating with science and math teachers over the years and using STEM ideas as part of my rehearsal process and my teaching mode. So that's really what today is all about. So I want to start with this idea of computational thinking, which I have in the sticky note and is in the bullet you received. 2 summers ago, one of my best friends, who is a computational chemist at our school, instructor, and a brilliant guy, called me up over the summer and he said, Scott, I want to come over to your house. There's a new term being batted around in STEM education, and I want to get your opinion of it. And he came over to my house that day. We had a cup of coffee, and he told me that this term, computational thinking, is really becoming a buzzword in science education. Let me ask you, is anybody in the audience, has anybody heard this term applied in your school or anywhere at this point? Has anyone heard of this concept of computational thinking? While you're responding, I will say that I had never heard of it at that point. And I chatted with my friend Bob quite a bit about it, and he started outlining the principles of computational thinking. And as he told me the principles, I was sitting there going, this is what we do every day in the music classroom. Yeah, the overwhelming answer is no. That's what I expected. And honestly, guys, if you walk away from this hour with this term and a good understanding of it and how it applies to our orchestra classroom and music and arts classrooms generally, I think you'll have power. So let me just outline the term a little bit. Computational thinking can be defined 2 different ways, and I'm going to give you both ways. The first way is with these 3 A words that you'll see at the top: abstraction, automation, and analysis. So let's walk through those 3 terms real quickly, and we're going to apply some of this to what we talk about. Abstraction, very simply termed, is problem formulation. Students are presented with a problem, and then they have to just articulate, okay, or a need, and then they articulate the problem and how do we approach it. So that problem formulation would be like looking at a piece of music and going, oh, okay, the problem here is the bowing. How do I fix that? The problem here is the fingering. How do I fix it? We do abstraction every day in our classes. The second, automation, means being able to express the solution. Okay, looking at a problem that has been formulated and going, okay, I know how to fix that. Well, in a way, that's principles of practice, right? So automation is something that we do every day as musicians, and we teach every day as music instructors. The third one, analysis, is then solution execution and evaluation. Going to work, getting the work done. We've expressed the solution. Now we have to execute it, and we have to then evaluate how well we've executed it. Well, I hope that all of you are listening to those 3 A's, abstraction, automation, analysis, and their definition and going, oh, we do this every day. So that's one. The second way that it is sometimes defined is by the next terms: decomposition, pattern recognition, generalization, and algorithms. So let me hit each of these. Decomposition is breaking a complex problem into smaller, easier parts. Well, guys, again, it's what we do as conductors and teachers every day, and it's what we're teaching our students to do. So decomposition. Pattern recognition, I don't even define for you because I think we all understand what pattern recognition is, and we do it every day, and we encourage our students to do it every day. Pattern recognition would include something like, hey, we're in the key of C major. I've got to play a second finger C natural instead of a second finger C sharp. I understand the pattern. And I believe a lot of what we do as string players is pattern oriented. Generalization is exactly the same thing as the term abstraction up at the top. It's one of the 3 A's. Really, generalization and abstraction are the same thing. And then finally, algorithms. And I will honestly tell you, I had to look this up, but algorithm is defined as an unambiguous method of problem solving. And for my money, that's really what string educators do and music educators do. Because have you ever heard maybe a performing musician trying to talk about how we solve a problem musically, and if they haven't really thought out the ambiguity of how to get there, you hear a lot of, well, I sort of do this and I sort of do that. And I think it's really our job as music educators, as pedagogues, to say, oh, it's not sort of anything. It is very much this. This is the way to get from point A to point Z. And we can go through this very unambiguous method of problem solving. So all of these things, these notions of computational thinking, I'm going to keep them right where they are because every example I give you today in our session is going to refer back to this. And I want to say one other thing, and that is that I have way too much content for us today in this session. And with that little explanation of computational thinking, which I think might be the most important thing we talk about today, then I want you to refer back to those with every example and see if you can define it in each example as one of these terms. Okay? So with that in mind, we're going to get started. So these are really examples of ways I bring math and science concepts into a rehearsal or a lesson. So here's one that's a very simple one that I use all the time, and students love it. It's the difference between a linear crescendo and an exponential crescendo. So my goal is that you would understand this, that a linear crescendo sort of incrementally gets louder beat by beat or subdivision by subdivision, and it's a linear line. Whereas exponential stays quiet longer and then explodes out. And this can be a very effective metaphor to use in a rehearsal. And trust me when I tell you, the first time you ask your high school orchestra for an exponential crescendo, sometimes even a middle school honors orchestra, they will execute it without you having to go much further than that. Maybe define the graph, and then boom, they will go. And by the way, some of these terms you might not just have right at your fingertips, but the word exponential literally means we use smaller numbers to articulate very large changes in power, basically. So small numbers create large changes. And so that's an exponential graph that you see. Okay. I sometimes even draw the crescendo with that curved line, so that they can see it on the whiteboard. Let's jump on. Next example. This is one I learned from a student. I love in the repertoire places that I hear I sometimes call this a lift land in my rehearsals, a place where we have a note and the bow lifts and then a big accent, yum, ta, where we emphasize that second note. The bow is lifted and there's like a lifting of energy before we set the bow and give the next note, yum, ta. This is what I call a lift land. And a student of mine many years ago said to me, hey, Mr. Laird, I think really what you're describing is activation energy. You can read the definition here. And by the way, while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and give you the handout. I forgot to give it to you. So it's in your offers, and you can download the handout that has this definition on it. So you don't have to be writing furiously. You can certainly have everything that we've got. Hey, could somebody in the chat just confirm that you're getting the offer now as well? So activation energy is a lot like a catalyst, if you're familiar with the term catalyst, but it's this idea where there is some kind of energy that allows us to get more energy. Or something that starts the energy. So for me, a lift land, this lift gets us ready, the set really gets us ready, and then boom, more energy following it. I also liken it sometimes to a diver on a springboard. Kind of gives you the same idea. So it's the energy needed to get over some hump. So activation energy is a great metaphor to use in the rehearsal setting. Oh, by the way, I'm going to go previous. I'll ask, does anyone know, like with this exponential crescendo, how would you define that? What word in my definitions would you use to define exponential crescendo? Is it one of the 3A words? Is it something else? I would invite you to share that. To my mind, the exponential crescendo metaphor is could be abstraction, and it also could easily be pattern recognition. When we go to the activation energy, so this is bringing, and generalization certainly could be one of them as well, Jamie, thanks. Activation energy, I think, really brings ideas of physics into this, and it's very similar. It gives us some kind of an abstraction and problem formulation where we can articulate the problem in a way that's different than the problem itself. It's, in fact, an abstraction. I'll give you another one of these that's just, I find very, very interesting. One day in class, I was teaching spiccato. And I had a very strong physics student say to me, Mr. Laird, spiccato is something we learned about in physics this week. It's something called an imperfect elastic collision. And I had no idea what that was. I'd never heard the term before. But an inelastic collision is one which part of the kinetic energy is changed from one form to another form in a collision. So the way they describe it in physics classes is when you bounce a ball, that's an imperfect elastic collision. And spiccato, when we really get it going and it's bouncing, it's an off the string stroke, is in fact a form of a imperfect elastic collision. It's imperfect because it loses some of the energy, and we have to add some energy with our index finger on a spiccato stroke. But it's a very a perfect elastic collision would be one that never loses energy. It just keeps going forever. But an imperfect eventually sort of starts high, gets lower, 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 and we're adding energy to keep the bounce at the same height. So ask your physics students about it, ask your physics teachers about it, and take your violin, have your students take their violin and discuss it with their physics teachers. It's a great way to integrate physics into into the classroom, into the orchestra classroom. Next, I have this concept of creating and limiting variables. This is one that I think goes less in the, it could be in the orchestra classroom, but I think it goes more to the practice room for students, and can be a great conversation in a more of a one-on-one idea. This is certainly a scientific concept where in experiments, scientists are looking to limit variables in things that they change in experiments so that they can understand why certain changes happen. And I believe this is really important for us in the way we practice. And I'll give you a good example. You've got a difficult passage, and a student is struggling with perhaps lots of things: the fingering in the passage, the rhythm of the passage, the tempo of the passage. Hey, Alejos, thanks, man. I'm so glad that you have described it. I'm glad that you said something there. It's nice to see you. So I really recommend that you encourage students to create variables and limit variables. So, for instance, difficult passage, one variable to create might be slowing down. That's a variable. We can change the way we're practicing the passage by slowing down. Another variable might be to, perhaps with a rhythmic difficulty, might be to change the rhythm and create some kind of an etude out of it. That's something that I do with 16th note passages all the time, where I'll have students create this kind of new etude. I bet you do it as well, with the first note of the 4 long, then the second note of the 4 long, then the third note of the 4 long, and then the fourth note of the 4 16th notes long. Each one of those changes is a variable. It's a creation of a variable and a limitation of a variable. And it's a very scientific way of approaching a 16th note passage. Limited variables and another way of disguising repetition. Jamie, you're really right. And I mean, when you think about the science mind, I mean, isn't that sort of what we do? We limit variables, and we want to change little things, but we don't necessarily want to change everything at one time, because then we don't know why we did or did not get a good result, right? Joe likes to tell his students to experiment, try something, and see what happens. I think that's, you know what, Joe, in this, that applies very strongly to what we're doing, because to me, I tell students to be a scientist all the time, to think actively about what they're doing and think about, well, how do I solve this problem? Because isn't that in fact what a scientist or a mathematician does every day? And it fosters curiosity as well. Okay, let's keep going. I've got lots of examples. I will not run out of examples today, guys. So keep the comments coming. And honestly, because it's so late in the conference and late in the day, I realize you could be wearing out at this point too. So the more conversational we can be with the chat and with me, I would really try at this period of time in a conference to be as conversational as possible in a session. So I appreciate the comments coming through. Guys, we can introduce data and formulas into the orchestra classroom all the time. This is one that I learned from my friend Ned Steinberger. I've been affiliated with NS Design Electric Violins for many years. And when Ned was considering making a fretted electric violin, which people have all kinds of opinions about, but I can make a good case for when a fretted violin is a great idea, he and I got to talking about frets and the math behind frets on a guitar or a violin or on a mandolin. Let me pull a mandolin up here. The idea here is, and you guys all understand this, is that the distance between frets lower, or the difference between a whole step lower on the neck and higher on the neck is different, right? The higher you go, the closer the whole step, or the closer the half step becomes. And so I got to talking with my friend Ed, who's just a brilliant, Ned, who is such a brilliant engineer, about how these calculations are done. And he said, oh, Scott, there's just a really common formula that we use for that. And he sent me a website for that. And I went ahead and dropped this on my math students, my students who are interested in math, and they geeked out over it for a while because it really does apply to violin, viola, cello, and the distance between our fingers in a tempered system. And by the way, I'm surprised nobody has asked me about tempered on violins. That's what I would have done, I'm sure. But obviously, these frets are tempered, not Pythagorean or just tunings. So if those are terms that you're not familiar with, those also are very interesting physics ideas to bring into your orchestra classroom. I think, do I recall that there was perhaps a session here at CSI on the band side on just tuning? Daryl, used to your students being smarter than you. Trust me, that's been my experience lots of times for sure. Awesome. Let's go on. I would say the data and formulas is algorithms. If we're coming back to my my computational thinking idea, and I'm wondering if anyone thought that. Here's a couple of abstracts that I use all the time. Alejos might remember this, or anybody that might be around. You know what, Rachel? You might be surprised. So obviously, some of these are high school oriented, but some of them aren't. I use a lot of these metaphors in middle school honors groups. A great one is the second one here, fight gravity, because I think students are always surprised when I'll say, well, why is it that we want to pull a long down bow? And that's easy to do, but playing a full up bow on a violin or viola is more difficult or more challenging in some ways. And if you get a little bit of conversation going, it's amazing to me that students will say, oh, gravity, that's why. And if they're really thinking that that takes more effort to push an up bow all the way to the frog, it's a way that I use all the time to get kids out of that sort of what I call the Mississippi hot dog region of the bow and to use their full bow in the lower half of their bow. The other one that I have on here, only solve the equation once, is a phrase that I use a lot when I'm talking about writing in parts. It seems that I have an epidemic of students who don't want to write fingerings in their parts or notes to themselves. And solving the equation once is something that will really get kids thinking about why it's important to make a note in their part so they don't have to resolve that equation every single time. It's sort of like a cheat sheet. And I think that kids, whether they're middle school or high school or elementary school, like to have that opportunity to do this. And some of the chat I think is important, and I'm going to take a little U-turn here because I am reminded of a conversation I had with a student about a little over a year ago. I was preparing this session for an ASTA conference. And I'd put it together. It was all these things I developed over the years. And I decided to ask my orchestra how they would respond to all of these kind of in a conference session. And we had a wonderful, wonderful, yes, Angelica, that's great to know. We had a wonderful conversation about it, but my concert mistress came to me after the conversation privately. And she said, Mr. Laird, can I sit in your office for a second and talk with you? And I said, sure, Belinda. And we sat down and she said, I really understand everything you talked about in this STEM in the orchestra classroom idea. And she said, but I want to offer you a little different perspective. And I said, okay, go ahead. What's your perspective? And she said, for me, orchestra is where I go to let my mind be an artist, not a scientist. And I thought it was an incredibly astute observation on her part. And I think it took a lot of guts on her part to come and share that that was a personal thing. And she said, all of my violin lessons leading up till now have been sort of very artistically oriented, a little less functionally oriented or scientifically oriented. And she said, so sometimes I would just rather think like an artist and not think like a scientist. And to me, I want you to know it was very well taken. We learned so much from our students. And what I notice is in a conducting situation is that when I bring up these STEM concepts, I get tremendously positive reaction from some students, and sometimes less than positive reaction. But it's a differentiation to me. Sometimes we meet kids with sports analogies. I used to use a lot of them. Frankly, in my current school, I don't use them that much because they sometimes really don't resonate with my students. The science and math analogies really do with my students right now. But here's what I'll say. I'll say working to discern that difference in our classroom is really important, and differentiating is really important. And having some of this language with our administrators, I think, can be really important, or our families. I think it just makes us more well-rounded in a certain way. So anyway, that's my perspective on that. Oh, the exponential versus linear graphs. Awesome. I'm glad to know you sent that email off. That's great. Okay, let's go to the next one. I just threw this up here. I'm not going to say much about this, but I use the metaphor of a three-legged stool when I'm teaching playing position, orchestral playing position, seated playing position. That's one of the ways that I get students to really get to the front of the chair and plant their feet on the ground. That this is the most stable of foundations to the earth, is a three-legged stool, because when a three-legged stool is there, even if the ground is uneven, it's a very stable foundation. And it's how I get people planting their feet on the floor in an orchestral situation, or one of the ways. So I just put it up there as an abstraction, to be honest with you, to use one of my A words. Okay, let's go on. This on this one, this is an algorithm that I'd like to share with you. I'm going to see if my videos work. Let me know how many of you have seen this before. This is a video of a string being pulled in super, super, super slow motion. It's actually playing. And you can see how the string is vibrating. It actually gives a student a very clear feel for what's happening with the vibration of the string when the bow is pulled across it. This is called a Helmholtz corner, is the phrase. It's on your handout. And the way it's vibrating top to bottom, bottom to top is known as a Helmholtz corner. So, okay, let me exit that video. And I'm going to show you one other one that I think is super cool. This one is very similar. This is a slow motion, and it shows you how a bow works on the string. This is called a slip stick. So, or a stick slip, excuse me. So the string sticks to the bow until it can't handle the force anymore, and then slides back. And if you haven't seen these videos before, I just really recommend them to share with your students. The URLs are included on the handout. Your physics-oriented, inquisitive students will love this. Okay? So that's the stick slip. Yeah, Jessica, cool. Carrie, the links to those are in the handout. Okay, I'm afraid that I might not get back to those links. If I might never get back to any more of the presentation if I go there. But I'll tell you what I will do. I will post those links in the CSI Connect pop-up group after the session. Okay? Thanks, Karen. Let's see. Let's go back to my slides. Guys, don't hesitate to hit me with questions if you've got them. I'm keeping an eye on the chat. And I know I'm moving fast. And by the way, I do know that this stuff can freak people out. I'm not suggesting that all of us have to have the mind that I have and in this stuff. But what I am suggesting is that I'll bet some of your students have that mind. And if we can encourage our students by just having enough information for them to go a little further, it can be really enlightening and empowering for our students that are STEM oriented, for sure. This next one I would call automation and or analysis, and this would take too long to really dig into fully. But this is really a diagram of harmonics and overtones. And this little graph is a great way of showing students why octaves and perfect fifths are consonant and feel good. They feel restful together, and why minor seconds are dissonant and do not feel restful. So very quickly, what I'll show you is this. If you look at A2, which is a low A, that would be open A on a bass, and A3, which would be a low A on a cello, you will notice that they share some overtones. They share 110, they share 220, they share 330, and they share 440. So they share all of those overtones, and it really makes them consonant. They sound good together. If we go to the perfect fifth, the E's, E2 and E3, you'll see some common numbers, 330, 660, and others. They share less overtones, but some. And so they're not as consonant as an octave, but they're very consonant. Now, if you go to the B's and you look down that, there are nothing that looks like 110, 220, 440, 330. They share no overtones. So they are more dissonant to our ear. So we can actually learn a lot about consonance and dissonance through the math and the physics of overtone theory. Just a little primer. But when I learned this a number of years ago, it kind of opened up a lot of doors to the way my ears think about intonation and how we tune strings and that kind of thing. Those sympathetic vibrations, when we're tuning open fifths, they're mathematical in every way. So it's just kind of interesting to know. Okay. All right, let's keep going. By the way, guys, I have a series of, I didn't even think about this. I should have shared it as an offer. I'll share these on the CSI Connect thing too. I have a series of videos called Where Music Meets Science. You can search that on YouTube. It's a 3-video series. They're all about 20 to 25 minutes long, and they would be great to use someday when you have a sub. They're really interesting. They are called Where Music Meets Science. If you search that and my name on YouTube, you'll find it. In fact, if somebody out there that's in the session wants to search that and put up a link to the first one, that would help everybody out. That would be cool, because I go over the harmonics and overtones thing pretty clearly in that, and it's designed for middle and high school. Another thing that students have all the time right now are access to Audacity, a program that is a great recording program. And on a laptop with a free version of Audacity, we can record ourselves playing notes and really see the 4 parts of a sound wave, which include the attack, the decay, the sustain, and the release. And you will find these 4 components of a sound wave, whether you're playing spiccato, staccato, legato, long tones, sustained tones, or very short tones. So it's a great way for students to learn a little bit about the physics of sound, to learn about the term transient, which is the articulation of a sound, and to see what their articulation looks like. And this whole thing, the attack, the decay, the sustain, and the release, is an envelope. So it really does bring technology into the mix a little bit, and a great way to get sciencey with students in a free way with a computer and a recording program. I'm down to about 7 minutes left in the session. I'll give you one more of these or 2, and then I'll open up for questions. This is one that I really wanted to make sure I got to. It's this concept of static versus dynamic. So we all use the term dynamics in our rehearsals and our classes all the time. But have you ever really considered the definition of the word dynamic? You know, dynamic, defined is characterized by constant change, activity, or progress. So to me, I love to introduce this concept to orchestras in terms of dynamics could include volume changes like we do. Vibrato makes a piece more dynamic. Direction, phrasing makes a piece more dynamic, and many, many other things do. In fact, I would argue that a dynamic ensemble physically is a more enjoyable ensemble to watch. And I use these concepts in rehearsals all the time, and I would encourage you to try that out as well. And then what's really awesome is then you can introduce the term static, which is stationary or fixed, the opposite of dynamic. And then you can really get into ideas of even orchestration. A lot of times, if you think to elementary or middle school scores and other scores, you'll have one voice that is dynamic, has the moving line, while another voice is static, maybe has a whole note or repeated eighth notes. So they're more static in their harmony. And the melodic voice might be the dynamic voice. Those terms used in an orchestra can be extraordinarily telling and nomenclature that is very effective with students. And they're real words. I mean, they're real terms that make sense in the context of an ensemble. So I encourage you to dig into the concepts of dynamic versus static. And to my my one colleague who mentioned about their younger kids might being a little overwhelmed by this, this is a concept that middle school kids can really dive into, I think, very early. A couple of years ago, my son was in an engineering program in high school, and it was like the first day of school in his program. And he came home with a worksheet on simple machines. And I was developing this session at the time. And I thought, wow, these simple machines that are being taught in engineering class are found all over the place in the orchestra. Let's see, a fulcrum and a lever. We find a fulcrum at the bridge on a violin or on a string instrument. A wedge is found in our tuning pegs, right? All the tuning pegs are wedges. A screw is found on your fine tuners or on your machines on a bass. There and others. You know, you can do the work a little bit. Force and load found with strings and how we create force as we pull the tension of the strings. So I just thought I'd share this with you as an example of another spot that we can find science and math in the orchestra class. I'm going to go to one more. I think I have one more because it is well worth mentioning today. And of course, you've got the handout that has some more included on the handout, and I'll encourage you to check that out further. But this is one that I use all the time in the orchestra. The idea of kinetic energy, potential energy, and then kinetic energy again. So, okay, energy in. If a bike is riding up a hill, they're like doing work to build up energy. When you're at the top of the hill, you have the most potential energy because you've done all that work on the input. And now what are you going to do? Ride down the hill fast. Okay. So where's the metaphor in the orchestra? Maybe you can think of one. Here's mine. If I'm doing a Haydn symphony or any piece that has a slow introduction, to me, that's the energy in. It's the buildup, the work to get us to the top of the hill so that we're ready now, metaphorically, to fly down the other side of the hill when we hit the allegro portion. So to me, the kinetic and potential energy metaphor really, really works. And yeah, absolutely, Xander. So anyway, that's one place that I use it. The exponential crescendo is a wonderful example of a use of a buildup of energy and then wham, more kinetic energy on the output side. That's right. And the kinetic in is the slow, slow, slow. Don't let it all out at once. Wham, then let it explode out to the end. And it's very, very, very effective. So let me ask you guys, we've got about 2 minutes, 3 minutes left. I want to thank you for your attention today and your input. I would encourage you all, if you're interested in maybe more of these ideas, my blog is called Thoughts of a String Educator. And I'd like to encourage you to go and maybe fly around the blog a little bit. It's been there for about 10 years, and there are many ideas presented there, but I'd welcome you there. And I want to say very strongly that if I can help you in any way or be of service to you, I'm more than happy to do so. But more than anything, as this wraps up the Conn-Selmer Institute, for many of you, I would just tell you how pleased we are that you were part of this event this week. We hope that your takeaways are many, and we hope that you found some inspiration in not only my words, but the words and ideas of all of our great faculty. And I just want to tell you, I want to reiterate my thanks to Conn-Selmer and their dedication to all of us as educators in the last couple of months has been immeasurable, and I certainly want to express my thanks. And I want to thank you guys. It has truly been an honor to have you in my session today. If there's anything else I can do for you, any questions as you're moving on, please don't hesitate to let me know. And I look forward to seeing you, hopefully face to face, another year at the Conn-Selmer Institute.